April 17, 1945. Camp Stark, New Hampshire. The morning mist clung to the barbed wire perimeter like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release its grip on another dawn of captivity. The scent of pine needles mixed with the metallic tang of fear as 73 German women shuffled in formation across the compound's gravel yard. Their gray Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms hung loose on frames diminished by months of rationed hope. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense, but Wehrmacht Helferinnen, female auxiliaries who had served as radio operators, clerks, and anti-aircraft assistants in what they believed was their fatherland's righteous crusade. Ingrid Müller, 22 years old, had spent her 19th birthday tracking Allied bomber formations over Hamburg. Greta Hoffmann had decoded enemy transmissions in Berlin bunkers, while American shells shook plaster from the ceiling above her head. They had been taught that capture meant disgrace, torture, perhaps death. The propaganda films had shown them images of savage Allied soldiers, of prisoners worked to death in camps designed to break the German spirit. Now, standing before an American sergeant with kind eyes, who spoke to them not as enemies but as human beings, something fundamental began to shift in their understanding of the world. The American officer, Captain James Morrison from Toledo, Ohio, carried with him a clipboard and an expression of genuine concern. His words, translated through Corporal Friedrich Weber, a German-American interpreter, would shatter every assumption these women had carried about their captors. "Ladies," Morrison began, his voice steady and matter-of-fact, "you are free to walk anywhere within the camp boundaries. No guards will accompany you. The commissary is open. The recreation hall is available. You may gather in groups to talk, to sing, to write letters home." The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound but the profound quiet of worldviews colliding. These women had been conditioned to expect brutality, had steeled themselves for the degradation they had been told was inevitable. Instead, they found themselves facing something far more unsettling, unexpected humanity from those they had been taught to hate. To understand the magnitude of this moment, one must first grasp the context from which these women emerged. By 1945, Nazi Germany had mobilized nearly 500,000 women into auxiliary roles within the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine. They served as Flakhelferinnen, anti-aircraft assistants who tracked enemy bombers and calculated firing solutions. They worked as Nachrichtenhelferinnen, communication specialists who maintained the vital flow of military intelligence. They functioned as the invisible backbone of a war machine that had told them their enemies were subhuman monsters bent on the destruction of German civilization. Dr. Wendy Lower's groundbreaking research revealed that these women were not merely passive participants, but active contributors to the Nazi war effort. Many had volunteered not from ideological fervor alone, but from a complex mixture of patriotic duty, economic necessity, and the promise of adventure beyond the traditional domestic sphere. They had been recruited with promises of serving something greater than themselves, of protecting their homeland from the Bolshevik hordes and the racially inferior Americans who sought to enslave the German people. The propaganda apparatus had been particularly effective in its portrayal of American treatment of prisoners. Joseph Goebbels' ministry had disseminated countless stories of torture, starvation, and deliberate humiliation. German newspapers had published fabricated accounts of American prison camps where German soldiers were worked to death, denied medical care, and subjected to psychological torment designed to break their will to resist. These women had entered captivity expecting to face the barbarians their government had described in such vivid, terrifying detail. Yet here they stood, being offered freedoms they had never expected to experience as prisoners of war. The contrast between expectation and reality began immediately. Where they anticipated armed guards at every corner, they found none. Where they expected to be herded like cattle, they were addressed by name and rank. Where they had prepared themselves for starvation rations, they discovered a mess hall serving portions larger than what many had seen during the final months of the war in Germany. Corporal Weber, the interpreter, had emigrated from Bavaria to America in 1923. His presence served as a bridge between two worlds, his fluent German carrying not just words, but cultural nuances that helped these women begin to process their situation. "The captain wants you to understand," Weber explained, "that you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You have rights here. You will be fed, housed, and given medical care. You will be allowed to correspond with your families. You will not be forced to work, though work details are available for those who wish to earn small wages." The word wages struck them like lightning. In Nazi ideology, prisoners were to be exploited, their labor extracted without compensation as part of their punishment for opposing the Reich. The concept that their captors would pay them for work was so foreign to their understanding that many initially suspected it was some form of psychological warfare, a trick designed to lower their guard before the real punishment began. Greta Hoffmann, who had served as a radar operator near Munich, later recalled in her memoir, "I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. Surely this kindness was temporary, designed to make us soft before they revealed their true intentions. We had been told that Americans were crude materialists who understood only force and exploitation. This gentleness seemed impossible, almost supernatural." The women were assigned to barracks that, while austere, contained luxuries they had not expected. Individual cots with clean mattresses, blankets that smelled of soap rather than mildew, and windows that were not barred. Each woman was given a small wooden box for personal belongings, a gesture of respect for their individual dignity that contradicted everything they had been taught about Allied treatment of prisoners. But it was the commissary that truly began to erode their ideological foundations. On their second day in the camp, the women were escorted to the post exchange, a small store stocked with items available for purchase using the scrip they could earn through voluntary work details. The shelves, while modest by American standards, represented an abundance that seemed almost obscene to women who had endured years of rationing and scarcity. Bars of real chocolate sat next to tins of preserved fruit. Cigarettes were available in quantities that seemed impossible. Personal hygiene items, soap, toothpaste, combs, were displayed openly, available to anyone with the modest means to purchase them. The chocolate became their symbol, their touchstone for measuring the vast gulf between their expectations and their reality. In Germany, chocolate had been a memory since 1942. The last genuine chocolate many had tasted had been hoarded Christmas gifts from better times. Here, wrapped in silver foil and bearing the exotic names Hershey and Nestlé, were confections that represented not just sweetness, but the abundance of a society that could afford to give such luxuries to its enemies. Maria Lang, a 24-year-old communications specialist from Dresden, purchased her first chocolate bar on April 20th, Hitler's birthday, though the irony was lost on her at the time. She later wrote, "I held that chocolate bar for nearly an hour before opening it. It seemed too precious, too impossible to be real. When I finally tasted it, I wept. Not from happiness, but from confusion. How could our enemies treat us better than our own government had treated us in the final months of the war?" The abundance extended beyond material goods to something far more precious: information. The camp library contained newspapers, American newspapers that reported truthfully about the war's progress. For the first time, these women learned the full extent of Germany's military collapse. They discovered that Berlin had fallen, that Hitler was dead, that the war they had been told was on the verge of victory had actually been lost for months. The American Red Cross distributed forms for contacting family members, forms that would actually be processed and mailed, not confiscated as potential intelligence. The women were encouraged to write letters home, to inform their loved ones of their safety and treatment. Many hesitated, assuming this was a trap designed to gather information about German military capabilities or civilian morale. But as weeks passed and letters arrived from home in response, They began to understand that their captors had no ulterior motive beyond basic human decency. The transformation was not immediate nor universal. Ideological conditioning does not evaporate in the face of kindness. It erodes slowly like water wearing away stone. Some women clung to their Nazi beliefs with the desperation of drowning swimmers clutching debris. They interpreted American kindness as weakness, evidence of the decadent society their leaders had described. They whispered among themselves that this treatment was temporary, that they were being fattened for slaughter, or prepared for some more sinister fate. But others began to question everything they had been taught. The seed of doubt, once planted, grew with remarkable speed. If the Americans were not the monsters they had been told to expect, what else had they been told that was untrue? If their enemies could treat them with dignity and respect, what did that say about the society that had taught them to hate? Ingrid Müller became something of a camp philosopher, engaging in long discussions with Corporal Weber about the nature of democracy and individual rights. She struggled to understand a system where authority derived from consent rather than force, where citizens could criticize their government without fear of imprisonment. The concept seemed simultaneously appealing and terrifying. Appealing because it promised dignity and self-determination. Terrifying because it placed the burden of moral choice squarely on individual shoulders. In Germany, she told Weber during one of their conversations, we were told what to think, what to believe, what to value. It was simpler in many ways. There was always someone to tell us what was right. Here you seem to expect people to decide for themselves. How do they know what to choose? Weber's response was characteristically American in its practical idealism. They choose, and they live with the consequences. Sometimes they choose poorly, and they learn from their mistakes. But they choose as free people, not as subjects. The women began to observe American democracy in action through the small details of camp life. They watched as enlisted men respectfully disagreed with officers, as decisions were debated openly, as individual opinions were solicited and considered. They saw American guards reading newspapers that criticized their own government, something that would have been unthinkable in Nazi Germany. They witnessed chaplains from different religious traditions conducting services without conflict or competition for state approval. Perhaps most shocking of all was the arrival of American women. Red Cross volunteers, USO performers, and military nurses who visited the camp to assist with recreational programs and medical care. These women shattered another fundamental assumption about American society. Nazi propaganda had depicted American women as either degraded objects of male exploitation or masculine caricatures who had abandoned their natural roles as wives and mothers. Instead, the German prisoners encountered women who were clearly valued members of society, who spoke with confidence and authority, who moved through the world with a freedom and dignity that many German women had never imagined possible. Lieutenant Sarah Harrison, an Army nurse from Philadelphia, treated the German prisoners with the same professional competence she afforded American soldiers. Her presence forced the prisoners to confront uncomfortable questions about their own society's treatment of women. The USO performers were perhaps even more revolutionary in their impact. When a small troop arrived to perform for both American guards and German prisoners, the women were stunned to see entertainers who combined obvious talent with genuine joy in their performance. These were not the grim, propagandistic productions they had known in Germany, but expressions of pure artistic creativity performed for no purpose beyond the simple human pleasure of entertainment. The chocolate bars they purchased and saved became their private rebellion against their own past. Each sweet morsel was a small act of apostasy, a rejection of the ideology that had taught them to expect nothing but cruelty from their enemies. They began to associate American abundance not with decadence, but with a society that could afford to be generous because it was fundamentally secure in its values. By summer 1945, many of the women had volunteered for work details not from financial necessity, but from a desire to contribute something useful to the community that had treated them with such unexpected humanity. They worked in the camp laundry, assisted in the kitchen, helped maintain the grounds. The work was voluntary, fairly compensated, and conducted under conditions that respected their dignity as human beings. The letters from home painted an increasingly desperate picture of a Germany in ruins. Families were starving, cities lay in rubble, and the survivors were struggling to comprehend the magnitude of their nation's moral collapse. The discovery of the concentration camps had shattered any remaining illusions about the regime they had served. As details of the Holocaust emerged, many of the women faced a crisis of conscience that went far beyond questions of military defeat. Greta Hoffmann received a letter from her sister describing the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. The description of conditions there, of the systematic murder of innocents, of the bureaucratic machinery of genocide, forced her to confront her own complicity in a system of unprecedented evil. "I kept telling myself that I was just a radar operator," she later wrote. "I never killed anyone directly. But the bombers I helped shoot down contained men who were fighting to stop what was happening in those camps. How could I not have known? How could we all not have known?" The American chocolate, sweet and abundant, became a symbol of the moral choice that lay before them. They could cling to the bitter ideology of their past, or they could embrace the possibility of a different kind of society, one based on individual dignity, democratic governance, and the radical proposition that former enemies could be treated as human beings worthy of respect. The psychological transformation was documented by camp psychiatrist Major Robert Goldman, who conducted voluntary interviews with the prisoners. His reports noted a pattern of ideological crisis, followed by gradual acceptance of democratic values. "These women," he wrote, "are experiencing the collapse of their entire worldview. The kindness they encounter here is not just unexpected, it is genuinely revolutionary in its implications for how they understand human nature and social organization." Major Goldman observed that the women's shock at their treatment stemmed not just from their expectations of brutality, but from their fundamental misunderstanding of American society. They had been taught that democracy was a facade, masking cruel exploitation, that individual rights were meaningless abstractions used to deceive the masses. Experiencing the reality of democratic governance, even in the limited context of a POW camp, forced them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about political systems and human nature. As autumn approached and discussions of repatriation began, many of the women faced an unexpected dilemma. They no longer wanted to return to Germany. Not because they had become Americans, but because they had become Democrats. They had tasted freedom, not just physical freedom, but intellectual and spiritual freedom, and found it intoxicating. The chocolate bars they had saved became gifts exchanged among friends, symbols of their shared journey from hatred to understanding. Some women broke their chocolate into small pieces, sharing it with American guards as gestures of gratitude and friendship. These simple exchanges represented profound acts of reconciliation between former enemies. Ingrid Müller, who had been among the most resistant to American influence, became one of the camp's most effective advocates for democratic values among her fellow prisoners. She organized discussion groups where women could process their experiences and explore their changing political beliefs. "We must understand," she would tell them, "that we were not just defeated militarily. We were defeated morally. The question now is whether we will learn from this defeat or repeat the mistakes that led to it." The letters they wrote home began to carry a different message. Instead of simply reporting their safety and well-being, they began to describe their captors' kindness, the abundance of food and medical care, the respect shown for their dignity as prisoners. Many families in Germany initially dismissed these reports as evidence of brainwashing or coercion. The idea that Americans might treat German prisoners well seemed as impossible to those at home as it had seemed to the prisoners themselves upon arrival. But the evidence was overwhelming. Photographs sent home showed healthy, well-dressed women engaged in recreational activities. Letters contained detailed descriptions of camp life that contradicted every piece of Nazi propaganda about American brutality. Slowly, word began to spread throughout Germany that something unprecedented was happening in Allied prisoner of war camps. The chocolate remained their most powerful symbol, but it was joined by others. The books they borrowed from the camp library, works by American authors that explored themes of individual freedom and democratic governance. The newspapers they read that criticized American policies without fear of government reprisal. The religious services they attended where different faiths were practiced openly and without conflict. Each symbol represented a different aspect of the free society they were discovering. The abundance represented by chocolate was not mere materialism, but evidence of an economic system that could provide for its citizens' needs and wants. The intellectual freedom represented by books and newspapers was not chaos, but the foundation of informed democratic participation. The religious tolerance they witnessed was not weakness but strength, the confidence of a society secure enough in its values to allow dissent and diversity. By November 1945, as the first groups of women prepared for repatriation, the transformation was complete for many. They were returning to Germany not as defeated enemies, but as converts to democratic ideals. They carried with them not just memories of American kindness, but a vision of what their own society might become. The farewell ceremonies were emotional affairs. American guards who had initially viewed their charges with suspicion and caution now saw them as individuals worthy of respect and friendship. The women, who had arrived expecting torture and humiliation, were leaving with profound gratitude for an experience that had changed their understanding of human possibility. Captain Morrison, who had delivered that first shocking announcement about their freedom to move around the camp, addressed them one final time. "You came here as our enemies. You are leaving as people who understand that former enemies can become friends, that different peoples can live together in peace and mutual respect. Take that understanding home with you. Help build a Germany that your children can be proud of." The impact of these women's experiences extended far beyond their individual transformations. Upon their return to Germany, many became advocates for democratic reconstruction. They joined political parties, participated in local governance, and worked to build institutions based on the principles they had observed in American captivity. Their children would grow up in a democratic Germany, inheriting freedoms that their mothers had first experienced as prisoners of war. The chocolate bars, long since consumed, lived on in memory as symbols of the abundance possible in a free society. The kindness they had received from their captors became the foundation for their own commitment to treating others with dignity and respect. The shock they had experienced at being told they could walk freely around their prison camp evolved into a deep appreciation for the freedoms that democratic societies extend even to their enemies. Greta Hoffmann, who became a prominent advocate for German-American friendship in the post-war period, would often tell audiences, "The most shocking thing about our captivity was not that we were treated well. It was that we had been so thoroughly conditioned to expect cruelty that kindness seemed impossible." The real victory of democracy is not that it defeats its enemies on the battlefield, but that it transforms them into friends through the simple act of treating them as human beings. In the end, the story of these German women prisoners of war is not just about their individual transformation, but about the power of democratic values to transcend hatred and prejudice. Their shock at being allowed to walk freely around their prison camp was really shock at discovering that their enemies possessed a kind of strength they had never imagined. The strength to extend mercy to those who had shown none, to treat with dignity those who had embraced brutality, to offer hope to those who had chosen despair. The chocolate they shared, the books they read, the letters they wrote home. These simple acts became the foundation for a new relationship between former enemies. In their freedom to move within the confines of their captivity, they discovered the larger freedom that democracy offers, the freedom to choose who they wanted to become, rather than remaining trapped by who they had been told they were. And in that choice, made one small step at a time across the grounds of an American prisoner of war camp, lay the seeds of the democratic Germany that would emerge from the ashes of the Third Reich. a Germany where former enemies could indeed become friends, where abundance could replace scarcity, and where the freedom to walk without guards could expand into the freedom to live without fear.